If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 4. This is where we'll be spending our time today. Jesus has gone into the synagogues. That's been his habit now. He goes in and he preaches and teaches. And he's also been doing miracles around the Lake Galilee, the Gennesaret, Lake Gennesaret, Lake Tiberias, it's also called, this same body of water. And these miracles aren't unlike miracles that people have been expecting him to do. They're very similar healings, people having demons being released from the oppression of demons, lepers being healed, blind people seeing. I mean, lots of things are happening. And the people also recognize something about Jesus' preaching and teaching that is very different. The miracles are great, but they recognize something about Jesus and the way that he preaches and teaches that is very different from every other teacher they've ever known. So let's take a look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 31. Jesus went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath was teaching the people. And everyone was amazed at his teaching because he spoke as one having authority. In the synagogue there was a man who was possessed by a demon, an evil spirit. The man cried out at the top of his voice, "Oh, what do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? We know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. He didn't speak to the man. "Come out of him." And the demon threw the man down in front of everyone and came out of him without injuring him any further. All the people were amazed. And they said to each other, "What kind of teaching is this? With authority, he gives orders to the demons and they come out." And the news about Jesus spread throughout the surrounding region. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the house of Simon Peter. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and the fever left, and she got up at once and began to wait on everyone who was there. We're going to continue with the text in just a moment. I want to stop there. A couple of miracles stand as a kind of a testimony here to Jesus' capacity to do these things. Now, the text says he went down to Capernaum. That's not a text. He's going north. Nazareth is south of Capernaum. He goes north, but the going down is because he's going down in 1,800 feet of elevation from Nazareth to Capernaum. So it's actually quite technically correct that he would say this. And the people were astonished about Jesus, not so much, they were astonished about all these healings and the demonic oppressions that people were being set free from. But they're astonished in the way he's speaking here. He's speaking these words out. The contrast would be with all of the rabbis and other teachers. When they taught, they would say, Hillel said 200 years ago these things about this. Jesus doesn't do that. He just speaks these words straight out and leaves them hanging there. He's speaking the words from the Tanakh, that is the Old Testament. He's speaking them as though they're his words. He's not speaking them as somebody who's been taught something. He's speaking them as though these are his thoughts. It's pretty amazing. And people are hearing it and they recognize it. Now, some of the people were hurt by it. I would say this demon who heard it, that lived inside this man, was hurt. Amy Carmichael, the missionary to India, said something very interesting regarding the fact of God's words hurting people. She said this, she said, if you've never been hurt by God's words, then you've never heard God's words. I thought, wow, there's something to that. In other words, if something that comes from God's written word, whether it be from the prophecies or from the New Testament, does not sting us occasionally, then maybe we haven't really heard them. If they don't hurt something inside that causes us to want to be different in some way. Now, this particular word that came to this day, Jesus didn't say, there's nothing in the text that says Jesus said anything to the man who had the demon. And yet the demon spoke out. Now this happens throughout the New Testament. You see Jesus in an encounter with a person in whom an entity lives that is not part of that person. A supernatural, non-corporeal entity that is the enemy of God living inside this person. And those entities are crying out. Jesus didn't speak to the man. He didn't speak to the man. If he spoke to the man and said, come out of him, who's he talking to? He's talking to the thing that lives in him. And he tells it to come out. There were lots of exorcists around the landscape at the time of Jesus. There were a lot of Jewish guys doing this. They would come into a setting where some family would say, would you, kind of like the movies, come to our house and help us here. Our house has some demon living in it. Or my father-in-law has a demon living in him. Or our son has a demon living in him. Or our daughter, whoever. And they would ask the Jewish exorcists to come and to get rid of the demon. We'll talk about what you might think about that in just a moment. But they would ask for that. The Jewish exorcists had all of these elaborate, it was like Van Helsing and Dracula. You know, you've got this bag and you got all these little things in there. You got the wooden stake and the wooden mallet and you got the silver cross and you've got silver bullets and you got all this stuff with you. That's what the Jewish exorcists would do. They came with all this equipment. And they came with elaborate things that they would do, and they would ask the person who's being exorcised of the demon to do. You know, do this, look this direction so many times, say this word so many times. Here, let me pour this on you and see how that goes, and rub this into your hair, and on and on and on, shake this rattle, whatever they did. There were a lot of things that they did that were, and guess what? It worked a lot of times. These people were doing this stuff. I would say that when you see that sort of thing and you see these things working, it's not working after the power of God at all. There's an interest involved in having the demonic realm deal with the demonic realm, because it not only calls attention to the exorcist, and it also leaves the demonic realm still in charge. Jesus didn't do any of that. He just said, come out of it. And this thing came out. Now, when I first moved, and this is what I wanted to mention just a moment ago. I don't mean it this way. I've heard these things speak myself. So when somebody says to me, oh, this doesn't happen, I'm going to say, gosh, I can't go along with that. I've heard them. We had a guy when I moved to Pennsylvania. It's before Becky and I were even married. And his name was Don Rogers, and he had this kind of ministry. This is what he did. He dealt with people who felt as though they had some kind of demonic oppression going on. And he was just like Jesus in this sense. He didn't have a bunch of rattles. He didn't pour liquids over your body. He didn't grab your head and shake it. He didn't do anything. He wasn't some guy with beads of sweat and bulging eyes and all of that you think about when you think about somebody dealing in an exorcism. He would just calmly speak to these entities and say, you come out of him and you go wherever God sends you. So it's real. These things are real. And when Jesus encountered them, they spoke. And they responded to Jesus in a way that is so different from every Jewish exorcist that ever came. The response was, we know who you are. How do they know that? This man couldn't have known that about Jesus. The entity knows it, though. It makes me wonder, what was it like for Jesus to move about the countryside? What did the world look like to Jesus? I mean, if he encounters these entities, and they encounter him and they know who he is, then I'm betting he knows who they are. What did the world look like to him as he moved through Palestine and the common people encountering things like this? Man, this is just what James 2 says. James 2 says what? The demons believe and they shake with fear. Right? They believe in God. They know the scriptures too. Now, what happened in that moment was a very Jewish thing. Jesus comes to preach. This guy pops up in the service and says, oh, have you come to torment us before the time? We know who you are. That knowing who Jesus was not a compliment to him. In the Jewish context, if you knew something of someone with regard to their connection to their name, you had power over them. That's how the Jews saw this. So this demonic entity is trying to exercise power over Jesus by calling Jesus out in this service. Think about what this would be like. Just imagine us in here today. It's kind of quiet. The air's off now. It's softly raining. There's nothing happening in here of anything unusual. And if somebody just popped up and shouted like this in the middle of the service, can you imagine being there? What that must have felt like for everybody who's there? They noticed it, I guarantee you. People in our day look at this kind of thing and they just say, this is part of the gospel we just can't accept. Jesus seemed to be pretty on board with it. So I would say your argument's not with the gospel and it's not with me. The argument would be with him. Right? Jesus thought this was very real, and he dealt with it as very real. And we can believe things about the world, you and I. That's fine. But our belief may not be the reality. The reality may be something different. Sometimes it's better to let something from the outside explain to us what is real. And that's exactly what Jesus does here in this moment. Just imagine it. Jesus takes this thing in stride. I have to say, I remember one Sunday, there was a little girl here. And this little girl was talking as loud as I'm talking right now. Just that loud. Just having a conversation, no big deal. And sitting right there, And I remember at one point I was going through the sermon and all of a sudden I just stopped. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to type something you're reading and the TV is on and you can hear the words being spoken. It's really hard. You got two lines of thought going through your head all at the same time. And this little girl was talking. There's a line of thought and I've got a line of thought. And I just said, I can't do this. I can't make my mind think in this way. It disrupted it for me. Jesus didn't get disrupted at all. He just said, come out of him. I thought, wow. He makes a spectacle of this demonic presence. The presence wanted to make a spectacle of Jesus, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I remember reading a good book, and it was written by Donald Ray Barnhouse. He spoke of a time when a kid, I did this once in a different way. A kid came into a kindergarten with a balloon, and he had drawn the face of some kind of really ugly face on this balloon, and he brought it in, and he started telling the other children that this thing was real. And at first, they didn't take it in, but then they started to believe it. And then all of a sudden, one smart kid came up and popped the balloon. And of course, now you're just holding a piece of rubber that's got nothing on it that nobody cares anything about. I did that one time. I remember there was a kid in my neighborhood that I didn't like. And my parents didn't like him. And he came to our house and he climbed up on a fence post. We had a fence around our yard and he sat on the post. And I had a Halloween mask. And I was wearing the mask when he came in the yard. What am I doing wearing the mask? I don't know. But, when you're 6 years old, you do stuff like that. And so I was wearing the mask and he said, Rip, take your mask off. I said, it's not a mask. And we went on like this for about 20 minutes until that little kid started crying and ran home. He started to really believe that whatever mask I was wearing, that's who I really was. He accepted something about reality that was for him very real. We do the opposite. We look at texts like this and we say, well, that can't happen. Let me tell you, it can happen. I've heard it. Some people look at things like this. They say, well, what if we discovered that there was a planet, let's say Mars. There are people living there. What if they live there? What if they come and visit us? What if aliens come and visit us? Wouldn't that change how you look at Jesus and how you look at the gospel? And I said, I'm thinking to myself, why would that change anything at all? If God is, he's the God of the galaxies. He knows they live there. There's no shock for him. I would be surprised if they came, if aliens did show up and didn't say, we know God too. That's what would surprise me. I wonder, as we sit here today in our modern, socioeconomically comfortable position, what things are we subject to be oppressed by in our own lives? I wonder about that. I wonder what things hold us in. Are there economic things that hold us in that we fear? Social things? Medical issues that we fear? Something of our past? Something where we've been hurt in some way that we can't let go of? I just wonder. And I look at what Jesus did and I say, man, there's none of that stuff that's beyond him. He can set any of us free from anything from which we suffer if he so chooses. He can. So he goes and he heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Luke talks about this and he says, a high fever. That word that's translated high there is a Greek technical term for the fever. This was the kind of fever where you died if you had it. It's not just high. There's something else going on here. This is the kind of fever that people died from. And Jesus walks in. The text says he rebuked the fever. He spoke to the fever. Man. And then you notice something too about both of these instances that strikes me that says, Jesus is a lot better than I am, which may come as no shock to anybody. But he's a lot better than I am in that he's gone to the synagogue, he's preached, he's exorcised a demon. Now he comes to Simon Peter's mother-in-law and heals her. And then he just continues serving. And Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who's been laying there with a high fever, she gets up and waits on everybody. When I get home from church, I need a nap. I just need to lay down. I don't know what it is. I'm not doing anything all that hard. But Jesus doesn't need that nap. He just carries on with it. And he does this in a private setting. There are not a lot of people involved here. I love that kind of stuff. I want to continue with the text. It's like somebody said once, I love it when he does that stuff. In verse 40, when the sun was setting, the people brought to Jesus all the various kinds of sicknesses, and he laid hands on every one of them and healed them. Moreover, the demons were coming out of people and shouting, "You're the Son of God." But Jesus rebuked every one of them. And he wouldn't allow them to speak because the demons knew that he was the Christ. At daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place, and the people were looking for him, and they came to him where he was, and they said, "We don't want you to leave." But Jesus said to them, "I've got to preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that's why I was sent." And he kept on preaching in the synagogues around Judea. I just think there's something here so potent that these entities know who he is. We're in a day in which all of this gets questioned. That the fact that Jesus even lived gets questioned. The fact that Jesus is who he claimed himself to be, or who the Gospels claim him to be, gets questioned. These demons didn't have any questions like that. Now think about what that means. That there's a supernatural realm that you and I don't have direct experience with, I hope. And they know who he is when he's walking the earth. And then Jesus, it says, went to a solitary place. I wonder what that was about. Sounds to me like he needed to get away for just a few minutes and actually encounter God once again himself in some way to recharge himself. It's interesting to me when I see this. It reminds me of Martin Luther's hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." When Martin Luther in the text of the hymn says, speaking of Satan, our ancient foe, and he says, "One little word shall fell him." I think in our day, we have two mistakes we make when it comes to the demonic. One is we say they're not there. That's a mistake. The other is we pay too much attention. If you're sitting here today and you call the name of Jesus and the Spirit of God lives in you, lives in me, the demons are incidental along the way. Because as Martin Luther said, one little word shall fail them. That's correct. Biblically, Jesus didn't go into any kind of wild display. He just told them to come out. You and I have the Spirit of God living in us. We have that same authority. That's why that guy in Pennsylvania would just command them to come out, calmly as I'm speaking right now. And they would. And then he would say, and you go wherever God sends you. Think about this for just a moment. For you and I sitting here today. You and I, we look out and we see the trees, and we see the sky, and we see the clouds, we see the moon, we see the stars. We go to the Grand Canyon and see the mountains. We see all these things. When people say, as we talked about in Sunday school today, that we're just a little speck of dust in the universe, that's true. We are. But think about the fact that we look out on the universe and we see it and we're conscious of it. It's not conscious of us at all. That means something to me. The galaxies don't know we're here, but we know that they are. If you ever see an image of the International Space Station from the space station looking at the Earth, you can't see a single soul on the planet. You just see the land and the sky and the oceans. You see all of that. This person who's laying his hands, and that, by the way, is something brand new. Did you know that? In Jewish context, nobody laid their hands on anybody. Jesus did. He put his hands on people when they were sick, on the lepers, on the people with the fevers. And those same hands are the hands that spread out all those galaxies that we're looking at. That's amazing to me. This person who's saying these things, teaching in these synagogues, laying his hands on people, is the person who spread out the galaxies. I wonder how he looks at all that. People who encountered Jesus in this time were never the same when they encountered him. I think there's something going on with us that we encountered Jesus and somehow we'd seem to stay the same. Why is that? When God gives us salvation, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way before. The minute we come to him and ask to be saved, we're coming underneath him and we're subordinating ourselves to him as King and Lord. That's what we're doing. We think about salvation adding something to us. Why don't we start to think about it as something that's going to remake us? Do we want to be remade? I do. I don't want to stay this way forever. I want Jesus to remake me. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything